Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. As we begin the second season of Religion and we continue to find questions about religion and American culture at the center of public conversations and policy debates. The COVID-19 pandemic still rages on alongside political realignments and environmental catastrophes that are unparalleled in their ferocity and their impact on our social, political, and religious structures. The Center for the Study of Religion and Culture and American Culture is uniquely positioned, I believe, to facilitate these conversations on the relationship between these conversations, these cultural shifts, and the category of religion. For over 30 years, the center has brought together scholars and practitioners to engage religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our fields, on our campuses, and throughout our society. Religion and is just one series of a monthly conversations between leading academics and public thinkers to do this critically important work. And it is every third Thursday at 3 o'clock where we're going to come together and do this kind of work and have these kind of conversations. Today, our inaugural session of the second season is on religion and refugees and immigration. This session is an opportunity for scholars and practitioners to come together and talk about the history of the refugee crisis and connect it to the most pressing issues of the day. This season, we are planning to lean into conversations that not only bring together humanists and social scientists who are embedded in the academy, but we are also engaging theorists and practitioners who apply these knowledges and disciplines on the ground. This season, we're planning to cover a broad depth of topics from religion and museums to religion and sports to religion and conspiracy. The hope is to unearth new methodological frameworks and for us all to be introduced to new practices and engagement that will regale us both inside, outside, and adjacent to the academy. So I thank you all for joining us from wherever you are coming. And we do note that today is a high holiday for those of us who participate in the Jewish tradition. And because of that, and as for all of our episodes, we are taping it and we will make it available to you all when you have a chance to review it. Please remember, as we go to the next slide, that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Right? So not in the chat feature, in the Q&A feature. You can talk to each other through the chat, but we are hoping that you'll use a Q&A feature on Zoom, and this will enable our hosts and our panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this vital conversation. Now, let me introduce today's host for the conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Melissa Borja, who is an assistant professor of American culture at the University of Michigan, where she is a core faculty member in the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program. She researches migration, religion, politics, pluralism, and race in the United States and the Pacific world, with special attention to how religious beliefs and practices have developed in the context of the modern American state. Her upcoming book, Follow the New Way, Hmong Refugee Resettlement and the Practice of American Religious Pluralism, explores the religious dimensions of American refugee care. I'm so excited and so honored to have Dr. Melissa Borja with us this afternoon. Our other host for the afternoon is Dr. Solit Chaco, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the Religion and Urban Culture 2.0 project at Indiana University School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. That's a mouthful. She is particularly interested in exploring how local histories are reshaped through migration processes and how they are practiced and embodied. As a sociologist, she focuses on migrant refugee communities, and her current project looks at and explores the experiences of low-wage immigrant women workers in the US using an intersectional lens that includes race, religion, and gender. I'm so excited to welcome for the first time, this is Melissa's second time to Religion and, but for the first time to Religion and, Dr. Solit Chaco. And I will now hand it over to Sally, as we call her, and to Melissa, as they will introduce our other panelists and begin this very important conversation.
Thank you so much, Joseph. That was such a warm and wonderful introduction. I am so grateful to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning as well as talking through conversation with Dr. Borja, as well as Todd and Salah. As you all know, we are in this moment where thousands of Afghan refugees are arriving in the United States. and other places around the world after frenzied evacuation effort and bungled military withdrawal. This moment not only revives old debates about the United States' relationship with Afghanistan and the Taliban regime, but it also reopens critical questions about statelessness, displacement of people and communities, and the policies that govern and shape these people's lives. This is not limited to what is currently happening in Afghanistan. The ongoing arrival of migrants fleeing Central America and the contested nature of a US-Mexico border policy is also part of this focus. So as Joseph mentioned, in this religion and we have with us two panelists who will address the history of refugee and migration policies and the role of religious organization in supporting or challenging policies. Additionally, this episode will explore how scholars of religion and practitioners are employing new methods to study the movement, agency, and institution building of refugee and migrant communities. Our panelists today are scholars and leaders, particularly practitioners in the field of migration policy and refugee experiences. And as such, they are here with us to help us explore these issues deeper and help us think through some of the larger relationship between religion, refugees, and migration policy in the United States. Our first panelist is Salah Ansari. He's from Lutheran Community Service Northwest. Salah Ansari is the Senior Director, District Director of Multicultural Community Services at Lutheran Community Service Northwest. Mr. Ansari knows from personal experience the pain and suffering that refugees endure when they leave their homeland for a new country. He first came to the US in 1978 during a time of political turmoil and war in his native Afghanistan. He continued his education after arriving in the Northwest and earned his master's degree. In 1984, Mr. Ansari started his career at what was then Lutheran Family Services of Oregon and Southwest Washington, eventually becoming Senior Director, District Director of MSC. For the last 37 years, Salah has been helping develop transformative programs and services for refugees to rebuild their lives throughout the Northwest. Thank you, Mr. Salah Ansari, and we welcome you here. Our second panelist is Todd Scribner, who is a historian by training and has published on the relationship between a religion and refugee resettlement. He currently works for the Migration and Refugee Services of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He advises the Princeton Religion and Resettlement Project with Dr. Melissa Bora. Melissa, I'm going to let you take it from here with the first set of questions.
Thank you so much. One thing that's really wonderful about this conversation today is we have people with scholarly expertise as well as expertise as practitioners. And so I really want us to think about your different perspectives here and begin with a very basic question. We see so many words in the news today: refugee, migrant, evacuee. And so I wonder if you could set the table for our conversation by defining some of these terms and what they mean for the lives of the people who are falling into one of these categories as they come to the United States. And I invite you to talk about this in the present or with a historical perspective, because Dr. Scribner, I know you are a historian. Salah, could you please begin?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me in this panel. Wonderful to be with you. I am Salah Ansari, and I have been over the years, maybe almost 4 decades, working with refugees. Myself uprooted from Afghanistan way back in 1978. So those 3 areas, obviously the first one, evacuation, we may have heard in the past few weeks how an evacuation of US citizens and those who work with the US Army Afghans and others took place. Those images are still giving me shivers, and the images are quite powerful and they are also triggers for me when I left back in 1978. So evacuation, obviously the term itself is you're removing somebody from an immediate danger. And that's what was happening in Afghanistan several weeks ago. Obviously, refugee term is somebody who is fleeing for their life and are being, there is claim to a refugee status is being examined and then provided a safe haven in another country. So that's what the term refugee is. And you're fleeing your home country because of violence, and you must have a reasonable, credible, well-founded fear of persecution to receive that refugee status, and demonstrate the history of persecution because of your race, because of your nationality, religion, and membership to a group, particularly a political opinion. Those are the individuals that will then be considered for refugee. Obviously, refugee situation and human displacement has been with us from the dawn of history. And the third question, obviously, is the asylum. Asylum are those individuals, obviously, that are also fleeing persecution, but in terms of our US policies, that individual has to be in the US or at the port of entry to claim that status in terms of filing for their claims. One obviously is an asylum whose case will be heard affirmatively, and which means that they will present their claim to USCIS, United States Immigration and Refugee Service. And one is defensive asylum, which refers to individuals who is their case, if it's not affirmative, immediately is then transferred to the court proceedings, and then their case is being heard before a judge. And therefore, the claim for that is also a lengthy process and quite heart-wrenching for individuals to recount all of the past persecution in order to bring their claim forward. In those situations, oftentimes attorneys are involved. But lately, I mean, just in the past 4 weeks, another group is being categorized and given the humanitarian parolees or humanitarian parole program, and that's also provided to the Afghans because of the recent situation, that they will not have the benefit of somebody who enters the country as refugee or asylee. Basically, those individuals will not be receiving any federally funded program benefits, and therefore, not only they have to provide a fee to file for humanitarian parolees, but there ought to be a fiscal sponsor that will vouch for economic supports while they're in the States. This is quite a new category, which concerns me a little bit in terms of you have refugee, that these folks also meet the definition of refugee, as I stated, but yet they will be denied benefits, and that's the subject of a lot of advocacy these days, especially knowing what these folks have gone through in because of the US involvement for the past 20 years and so forth. But that's totally a different subject matter for discussion. But I'll stop here and let my other fellow panelists to also talk about this.
Well, thanks so much, first of all, for having me on here. It's a real pleasure to participate in these kinds of webinars, particularly as they're connected to universities. I've been out of the university for a while, and I kind of missed the setting. So this is always a pleasure. But Salah obviously touched on a lot of the categories. One of the things that makes immigration and migration policy so complicated is just the various categories that are really in place. And so it's not surprising that when you get into sort of advocacy organizations, a lot of people are lawyers. And they have their law degree because they have to parse a lot of the various kind of legal kind of precedents and categories and framings for, in order to, ideally help to support migrants who are coming to the United States or wherever they might be coming from, and in order to provide relief that's necessary for that purpose. So, so that's the first thing. Is I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty familiar just being in an advocacy organization, a lot of these different categories. And I think I just touched briefly on two things. The first, I would also just add another category of internally displaced persons. So, an internally displaced person is basically someone who has obviously been internally displaced through obviously acts of violence or war, conflict, other forms of pressure or persecution. They're forced from their homes, but they can't necessarily cross a border. And by virtue of not being able to cross a border, they can't apply for asylum. They don't necessarily sort of qualify per se for refugee status, even though they often would, were they able to get across the border and effectively apply for it. And so it's a category, and they still remain very much in a situation of risk because they're within the borders of those groups that are on the border of where they've been persecuted and forced to flee in the first place. So that's a big concern, particularly in this situation, related to Afghanistan, but really elsewhere around the world. And finally, I just point to the humanitarian parole situation. It's really important to recognize that a lot of them may apply for asylum, or they may, appeal to other humanitarian mechanisms to gain relief. But it's going to be very challenging for Afghans who come here under humanitarian parole to find the support. And this is why local engagement is so critical. It's not just an advocacy question, it's a local community kind of form of engagement of how do we, provide them a place to live, support, funding of some sort to help with food and clothing and education for children and that sort of thing. So it is actually, it's a substantial problem. The president, as I understand, has been put forth some requests for funding, and hopefully Congress will pick them up to provide support for these populations, but that remains to be seen. I'll leave it at that for now, unless there's some follow-up.
I would just identify a broad theme here, which is that these categories are meaningful in that they are tied to resources and the different legal pathways people have. And also they're very dynamic. It sounds like we have categories emerging and they change over time and the definitions change over the time. And this most recent category of humanitarian parole is of great concern. So I think calling attention to how these categories are constantly evolving makes the situation, from what I understand, very, very complicated.
It is. I mean, and that's one of the interesting things too. I mean, you're often sort of an aside, and I'll be brief, but oftentimes when we're talking about larger issues of immigration and kind of people who might be in an authorized status, there's appeals to, my grandparents came here legally, but if they would have come today, mechanisms through which they came, they may not have become legally. So you really, it's a lot more complicated situation when we're talking about admissions processes and the proper mechanisms through which a person can gain admission into the United States, because a lot of the legal mechanisms are really just a process of sometimes administrative power, but in large part, congressional legislation that's been passed, 30, 40 years ago, or maybe just last week.
So one of the things that really stood out for me as I was listening to Salah as well as Todd talk about is this complexity that has always been there with the categories, and now we see it emerging. And of course, the different resources coming from the state is in many ways limited to what the population actually need. And you had mentioned that there are these community resources coming in to help with the basic needs that the people need. And so I'm curious to the fact that with the current refugee crisis, also keeping in mind the previous groups of people who are internally displaced coming as asylum seekers or refugees or migrants crossing borders, what role does religious organizations play? What sort of support has been given previously and what continues to be given presently, and how does religious organizations sort of help resettle as well as just process, the whole documentation process for these different populations? And I'm going to start with Salah with this, since Salah, you have been working hands-on with Afghan refugees. And your organization is a religious faith-based organization. So could you share some of the ways in which your organization is supporting?
Definitely. If I may go back, obviously, after World War II, with the situation back in Europe, then number of refugees that were displaced and coming to the US. Obviously, refugee program was not as professionalized as it is these days, but in those days, who were receiving these folks were all the faith-based communities in local areas that assisted. And this term voluntary agencies that are being talked about these days is because these agencies, faith-based communities, volunteer their services to assist in the resettlement of refugees. So it's been a long tradition. And more recently, obviously, after the fall of Saigon, and the influx of refugees from Southeast Asia. It was, for the most part, these faith-based communities that volunteered their services in welcome our new neighbors. So that is a long-standing tradition as well. Lutheran Community Services Northwest, from 1975 up to now, have resettled more than 45,000 refugees in the Northwest. And of course, this work could have not been done alone. And who assisted us is obviously the churches, organizations that have come together based on their faith belief and what they believe to assist vulnerable populations. So it's a long tradition. It's been there and will continue to be there for Afghans, non-Afghans, and many other populations. So 45,000 refugees or more, they have come from all different faith beliefs, but once they arrive, we on the receiving end tap into those resources in terms of getting the support from the churches, not just for us, not the Lutheran churches, but other churches in the area, as well as many different groups, mosques, temples, synagogues, all of those, been an important ally of refugees in this work in this country. So.
Since I sort of come from the Catholic perspective, which is where my work really resides, I probably know that history the best. And one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about the history of the Catholic Church and its engagement with migration as one subset of a whole wide set of other issues, is a shift that's occurred over the 20th century. Really, if you go back to the end of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century, it's not a real controversial thing to say that the sort of the dominant Protestant elite that were kind of in charge at the time didn't like the Catholic Church much because they saw them as a threat to the constitutional order, that it was a foreign invasion, and Catholics gave tribute to a foreign ruler, namely the Pope. And so a lot of organizations originally were established sort of as parallel organizations to the secular or Protestant organizations that were evident at the time, in healthcare, education, so on and so forth. And Catholic Charities was established early on as a way to respond to the needs of Catholics, Catholic immigrants as they came, initially in that period. And if you move into the 1910s and 1920s, you see the Catholic Church responding to migration above and beyond Europe in the sense of the response to the Mexican migration, largely as a consequence of the Cristero movement, which is a part of the Mexican Civil War and some of the upheavals that were going on there and the crackdown on Catholics, within Mexico at the time. And you had a lot of Mexicans leaving Mexico and coming to the United States, and the Catholic Church was really responsive to their needs. So it's kind of an early reception example of refugees flowing, I guess asylees it would be, or but those categories didn't exist quite the same way, flowing across borders to the United States, and the Catholic Church would be responsive to them. But the shift really occurred around, the post-World War II period, where you had a lot of these organizations like Catholic Charities, which were initially responsive to the Catholic needs, kind of became much more responsive to the needs of migrants in general, that it wasn't really wholly focused on Catholics, but because of the changing populations, perhaps of refugee streams, that were less Catholic, less from Europe, perhaps more from Asia and the Middle East and elsewhere, which may not have had as significant a Catholic population. The church really began to, in its sort of social, not so much in its social teaching, but its application, I guess, of its social teaching at the time, really became much more responsive to the needs of migrants as a whole, and migrants as a person, rather than migrants, well, they're Catholics, so we can help the Catholics, with the expectation, that the Lutherans would help Lutherans and the Jewish groups would help Jews, and so on and so forth, which was really predominant up past the Second World War into the mid-decades of the 20th century. And so this, we can talk about this more if you want, but it's just worth pointing to the kind of the more universalization that has occurred in the church's response to migrants in particular, but certainly other populations as well. And I think you probably see something similar in other religious organizations, which were traditionally, originally responsive to their own needs, so the needs of their own people, so to speak, their constituency, but which changed focus as it moved into the later decades of the 20th century.
Todd, you mentioned the changing demographics of refugees, the changing religious demographics, and how that accompanied different approaches and understandings of the call to care for migrants in the Catholic Church. But I think it's worth building on that idea of the changing demographics of refugees coming to the United States and thinking about this issue of religion and refugee admissions in relation to not just institutions, but also public attitudes about refugees. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the importance of religion in American responses to refugees, and here I invite you to consider the religion of the refugees themselves. So we now have lots of refugees who identify as Muslim. We have lots of refugees who might not identify as anything at all. So the religion of refugees, we also know that recent years Islamophobic thought might be shaping American responses to refugees. So there's that aspect, but also religious developments within the United States, the rise of Christian nationalism, for example, in feeding particular responses to immigrants and refugees together. So tell us about the significance of religion in shaping American responses to refugees. Todd, do you want to begin?
Sure. Yeah, sure. That's a mouthful, and we could talk for a long time, obviously, but they're all really important. I mean, and I'll sort of approach it from one angle right now, and obviously I'd love to hear more about what everyone else is thinking on this issue because it's such a critical one. And that is sort of my work with Princeton University. One of the things that we've been doing, I'm working with them, the Office of Religious Life at Princeton University, and they launched an initiative, the Religion and Forced Migration Initiative. And within that is a kind of a series of other elements that we've been working on together that focuses on the role that religion plays in the integration of refugees in particular, but forced migrants more generally, after they arrive in the United States. So how do they use religious symbols and ideas to kind of help them with their integration process? And how does the integration process and their sort of resettlement and sort of original displacement affect their religious identity? And sort of in its whole, do they become more religious? Do they fall away from their religion? So on and so forth. One aspect of this that we're using to try and get a better sense is the oral history project. So we are engaged in interviewing refugees from all different walks of life, from all different time periods following their arrival. In doing their oral history, I think we've done about 150 so far. Primarily students have done it. I say we, but I haven't been that involved in the actual oral history project. But it provides a ton of insights into how refugees engage in this sort of struggle sometimes, or this sort of back and forth between their religious life, their religious identity, and their new status as sort of Americans. So that's one bucket. And quickly on the second bucket, to your sort of Christian sort of nationalism, white nationalism, which is emergent at times and in places. One of the other aspects we're looking at is how do local communities respond to the arrival of refugees, and how do these local communities, whether it's parishes or whatever, use religious language in such a way that it's more welcoming to refugees, sort of welcome the stranger kind of rhetoric that the Catholic Church and the Christian traditions use. But how can it also be, how is religious rhetoric used to be oppositional sometimes to the arrival of refugees? And so that's something we're kind of delving into more, where we focus more on the oral history component of refugees themselves, but it's an area that we would like to work on more. So this is calling out to anyone who's interested in that, who's watching, or to Purdue, we'd love to work with you if you have ideas as how we can pursue this kind of research further.
And in the chat, we are dropping the links to the project at Princeton that Todd mentioned. And I'm also going to put in a link to the specific collection of Afghan stories that we've collected.
That's great.
For your teaching and your own advocacy in your own communities. So Sala, what are your reflections on the significance of religion in shaping attitudes towards?
I think in terms of migration, religion really is a huge part of that phenomenon. A lot of refugees that have come to the US obviously were subjected to religious persecution, and that's one of many other reasons that they have fled their home countries because of those oppressive regimes. And of course, extremism in any faith produces all kinds of conflicts. And we witnessed, in terms of refugees, and the breakup of former Soviet Union as well, the breakup of former Yugoslavia, the Kosovar Albanians, and of course, even within these religious extremism, even in one faith, you have all these other elements as well that you're Shia Muslims, you're Sunni Muslims, and how these elements also created a lot of conflicts. And some of the refugees that we are still resettling from former Soviet Union, obviously was the Orthodox Christians having the dominance over some of the other evangelical Christians in terms of the oppression and so forth. So the refugees that are coming to this country, obviously because of those reasons, what they do find, however, based on those kind of their own identity, but also having the freedom to practice their faith in the US, obviously providing a much peaceful opportunities, but also how they are seen. Obviously, what the Afghans or any other Muslim population, obviously, you have seen a tremendous kind of preconceived stereotypes of who these individuals are, that you can be identified as part of the terrorist networks overseas, which plays into how the acceptance has been shaping in our society here in the US. In some of our government policies, the Muslim bans and all of that played itself. But for the most part, those who are not, extreme in their belief system, that we are all part of a human race, and based on our religious convictions, that we welcome a stranger in our midst. So the issue is quite complex, but yet on the surface, as human, the acceptance of another individual, and that's the beauty of folks that are coming and being accepted. Yes, there are obviously people are cautious, even in these Afghan refugees that are coming. Obviously, there are some concerns that we need to make sure that these folks are vetted properly, that they are not any bad groups that enter. And those fears are real and valid, but also for some, it produces a lot of fear and anxiety. But us in our work, we have to do a lot of education and dialogue and reconciliation in terms of, the acceptance of folks. So that's an answer for a very complex issue, but as human in humanity, there's a lot of forces that are the outpour of support that we see these days from all faiths in terms of coming together and helping the Afghan situation that goes beyond who you are and what your faith is.
Can I throw a kind of approach it from a little bit of a different angle as well? And this is all anticipatory and anecdotal and may have no legs whatsoever as we move forward. But it is something that's sort of come to my thinking as we've, as I've been doing some work, again, on an anecdotal level. So obviously we talk about sort of the kind of the xenophobic tendencies that has sort of been emergent over the past 4 years. And it tends to be sort of on the right, so to speak, for lack of a better way to put it. Where there's a sort of a resistance to immigrants as immigrants or migrants as migrants, and a sort of emergent kind of nationalism that is exclusionary rather than inclusive. One of the concerns that I've sort of begun to think about more, and this might be more of a problem from the left than of the right, and that is as you see kind of religion sort of in decline and an emergence of sort of the nuns kind of becoming more precedent. My concern is that you're going to have, what I'm wondering about is the extent to which you'll have kind of an oppositional approach more and more to religion and religious institutions and religious messages, probably from the left more than the right, at least at this point, but not necessarily so. And the reason why this is important in terms of migration is because lots of migrants are religious still. You have lots of migrants from Latin America, from Mexico, who are Catholic, evangelical, Pentecostal, so on and so forth. And so you have, on the one hand, if sort of the non-religious, or maybe even the emergent anti-religious kind of sentiment within segments, influential segments of American society become more and more predominant, it's a big if, but I don't think it's out of the question. To what extent will that be alienating the very institutions, religious institutions, that have played such a major role in engaging migrants on the one hand, and to what extent will it actually alienate the migrants that these groups might actually express some support for as migrants, but because they don't appreciate the religiosity of these populations, there might be an alienation that occurs. I think that this is a question that I don't know if it's been asked. I don't know who's asking it, if anyone, maybe they are. But I think we might be hit from both sides, both from an exclusionary right and an anti-religious left. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a worry, by way of anecdote, that I've heard religious organizations that have been trying to work with foundations and whatnot, and they've been told that they don't work with religious organizations, for example.
If I may just say a few words on one of the questions as to low refugee arrivals have impacted in terms of capacity for a lot of these refugee resettlement agencies. That's very true. That low arrivals, basically has gutted, for the most part, some of these voluntary agencies that resettle historically refugees. So now, once again, with the emergence of this very immediate need, we are struggling in terms of coming up with the kind of support that is needed. But once again, thanks to the outpouring of support from folks within our each faith communities, and to assist, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge, especially when these folks that are coming as a humanitarian parolees will not have access to federally funded benefits that other refugees are receiving. So mobilizing our network and working together to come up with resources. How do we pay for rent for a family of 5, 6 that are arriving and they don't have any beyond the $1,200 that they will receive, a one-time rent per person? There's nothing else. So it's upon these resettlement agencies, faith-based communities that are working hard to bring resources to the table to assist. So
I think Todd and Salah, both of you, in responding to the question about the role of religion for immigrants and refugees and those displaced, have also brought attention to this ongoing challenge that we all are facing right now with the decreasing interest of religion among the people in the US themselves, and the popularly we call the religious nuns. How that would be influencing going forth the role of faith-based communities that plays such an influential role for displaced communities who are coming in. So this is an ongoing question for all of us, and a challenge that we have to center as we think about not just the Afghan refugees, but with climate change and things sort of like shifting, and the US involvement in war has not diminished with the pullout of Afghanistan. It's a continuing process. So how should we think about the role of faith-based organization, and particularly the role of religion itself in the United States. And that being said, I definitely am welcoming all our audience members to continue putting the questions in a Q&A. We would love to have this conversation. There's just like both Salah and Todd have brought some of the very critical questions that we often think about, we are listening to, we are talking about it amongst ourselves, amongst our friends, with policymakers, with activists in different roles that we play. Unfortunately, we are limited to an hour to have this conversation. So let's maybe open it out to the audience members and have some of the questions answered. We do have a few questions, and actually I'm going to start with the climate change itself, because that's been also a present challenge. So we have a question from Ivan Berry. The question is, could the panelists please speak to the question of climate change? That is, the role of environmental change in driving displacement in well-documented, and the phrase, quote, climate refugees, frequents the pages of new publication, but the basic question of the legal entitlement of persons displaced by environment factors remain unresolved. I will let either Todd or Salah take up that question, because I think both of you would be able to just talk to many of these.
Well, the climate refugees definitely as a new realities of our environment, and to what extent we have caused the destruction of our environment, and to what extent it's the natural calamity in terms of forced migration because of the climate. And we see it internally in the US in terms of the wildfires. We see it through the situation in terms of all these hurricanes that we are getting with different, obviously, names that comes. And to what extent, and it's going to happen not only in the US in terms of addressing that internally for folks that are displaced from one state to another, but at some point in terms of in the global arena, obviously the issue of climate change is also putting an enormous burden on countries that are extremely poor and have no means. Fortunately, here in the US, we still have resources to address that kind of magnitude of these calamities that are happening, natural calamities in a lot of other countries. It's incredibly challenging, especially in the recent earthquake that took place in Haiti, and what the people are going through that. Obviously, mobilizing resources to address some of the challenges in those countries. But again, at what point those will make it into the US immigration policies, but at some point it will happen. But right now, that's not in the cards in terms of accepting folks to come to the United States because of climate. That hasn't happened, but I won't be surprised that at some point that will make it into that kind of a policy.
There's an interesting policy question here, I think, that surrounds, and it's about, we talked about categories earlier, refugees, internally displaced people, asylees, so on and so forth. But there's an interesting question: how do you refer to people who are displaced by environmental degradation, climate change? Because you have what, 26, 27 million refugees, right now around the world. I think the number is at this point in time. And maybe probably less than 1% actually ever get resettled, particularly now with the US basically dropping its sort of moral kind of leadership on that issue and not resettling many at all, maybe 10,000 this year, maybe, or this fiscal year. And so if you refer to them as refugees, then you've kind of doubled or tripled the number of people who are displaced and might qualify for kind of refugee status. If you're going to actually include them, sort of modify the proper legislative and international agreements to include environmentally displaced people as refugees, you then significantly increase the number of people to be resettled. And so, so there is, I think, some concern about referring to them as refugees, but nevertheless, rather than ignoring them, which you can't do, Salah is correct, it's going to have to be addressed at some point and in some way, perhaps, creating a new sort of visa system, a parallel visa system that would be responsive to the resettlement, so to speak, of these populations, or the admissions of these populations, that is not really directly tied to the refugee kind of cohort as well, because of the concern that you would end up overwhelming the system in a way, and it wouldn't be helpful. So that's just one aspect that I think is how do you categorize them, how do you designate them, what mechanisms are used to admit them, rather than just having them flee across borders because they have no other choice, because they can no longer live in their home country, that because of environmental changes that don't allow them to farm or to live effective and productive lives.
And I think the question is very important, knowing how the climate change has been so much influencing different countries. It's not just through fires or earthquake, but literally oceans, like, the water, countries are just disappearing. And so what would it mean for displacement? Like, what does displacement look like when suddenly there was a country, there was a place, there was a home, and it's no more there because of environmental change? So I think these are these very issues that, of course, has to be grappled with. But at the same time, there's a logistical question that we have from one of our audience members. It's interesting, many of the people who are commenting here, I know them, there are many scholars and practitioners. So a good friend of mine, Dr. Diana Gillespie, has this question, and maybe Salah, for you, this might be much more applicable, but Todd, please feel free to answer. The question is, over the past 4 years, the refugee resettlement infrastructure has drastically reduced due to the historic low levels of refugee arrivals. Can the panelists discuss how they are handling the admission of thousands of arrivals now, and how the faith communities are involved?
Todd, do you want to?
Sure, I'll go brief,
Okay.
and then I'll turn it over to you. So one of the problems, obviously, is that it's a per capita system, right? And so you only get money to a local organization or resettlement site when you actually bring in a refugee. And for a lot of sites, when you're not bringing in, capacity level, I guess, resettling refugees, then you put a lot of stress on these agencies and their ability to remain open. And so you've seen a ton of closures just because there isn't the capacity to do it. So you can have a law on the books that is still legitimate, like the 1980 Refugee Act, which sort of allows for the reception and sort of resettlement, but that, if you deinstitutionalize the processes that actually enable the law to be functional, then you can kill the law in other ways. You can make it moot. You can make it irrelevant, even though technically it's still the letter of the law is on the books. And this is, I think, one of the things that we've seen over the past 4 years, and I think it was intentional, to basically undercut the admissions. It doesn't really get to the answer that they're looking for, but it's sort of an explanation. And it's, I would say, I will let Salah, because he's sort of more on the ground. We're having a very difficult time of it, and we've seen closures, and we are hoping that the presidential determination will be higher and it will be followed through on actively. There are concerns whether or not it will be, but I'll let Salah, he knows better, I think, what's going on the ground and how that's affecting people better than I do.
There hasn't been a day that local communities are struggling with this issue of resources to how to address, while people are concerned and wanted to assist, but at the same time, pulling those resources in such a short time has been challenging. But it's not the lack of interest and will to do this. And the states are also finding themselves to come up with resources. State of Oregon obviously is putting a lot of state funds into the process. of resettlement. Some of the legislators are quite concerned as well. We are having dialogue and discussions. As a matter of fact, next week, both the two Lutheran churches in terms of the Lutheran response to the situation. And I'm very much in conversation with our colleague Catholic Charities, as well as the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. So it's a constant dialogue and how we can pool our resources together to address this emerging challenge for us all. So I don't know.
And if it could, sorry, but I mean, just sort of the point to what you're saying. I mean, it's like, how is that gonna? I mean, I'm curious. Is the moving forward? Is this kind of the structures that are in place currently to be responsive? Are they going to remain as is, kind of the status quo, or will they be responsive in a way that will kind of you'll see actually resettlement sites and resettlement agencies adapting in a way that it's going to look a little different. The whole resettlement program might look a little different, you know, in 10 or 15 years than it does now. If that's the case, how do we prepare for it and how do we anticipate it? Because it's very much against the interest of a lot of states to have a low refugee resettlement program. I mean, we talked a lot about essential workers for over the past year and a half, and you know, who's doing the meatpacking plants? Who's working at these meatpacking plants? It's refugees in large part, and migrants more generally, but refugees are a major component of a lot of these essential workforce, you know, that we praised and sort of honored for a while, but you know, we need them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think the traditional resettlement model is no longer applicable. So you do need to bring the entire community together. Obviously, I always say resettling a refugee is, you need the entire community. We need to get the business community involved. There's obviously a tremendous workforce shortage these days as well, that we need to come together in terms of pulling our community resources. Yes, I totally agree, Todd, that this requires a new, fresh, it's almost like sometimes these kind of crises will bring about changes as to how we address refugee resettlement in the future. But again, community response as a whole, community, business community, religious community, state, federal, county, all of these are needed to, and I think a system, a model will emerge in terms of best practices and how do we get together and respond to this crisis right now. So.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Our hope for this webinar, this panel, was to understand the refugee crisis and what's going on. And actually, we have come to a spot where we have more questions, how to sort of move forward with this. But also, both you, Salah and Todd, have given us a glimpse of hopes on what we could do as not just scholars, but also practitioners and community activists and advocates who are all here today with us. Because of the time limitation, we have to sort of move forward with what we had planned for the panel. And we have really amazing questions, and thank you all. If you want to reach out to specific panel members, please feel free to do that for those questions. We are very grateful for the time here. I'm going to hand it over to Melissa.
You liked the conversation today, and I hope you did. I invite you to do the survey, which will appear in the chat, and join us for the next Religion and Conversation next month, October 21st. We're going to be talking about religion and museums, and it should be a really fantastic discussion. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. And thank you especially to our panelists, Salah Ansari and Todd Scribner. It's been a joy and a delight. Thank you again.